There's dramatic new reporting about a clash between the president and his Secretary of Defense. The Washington Post reporting Trump and Pete Hegseth butted heads over munitions shortages that now threaten to limit military options with Iran. That's two sources familiar telling the Post Trump thought that problem had been fixed. The White House and Pentagon are pushing back on this reporting. And in a late-night social media post, the president argued, quote, the U.S. has massive amounts of munitions and that more were being manufactured and shipped. At the same time, he's calling those stories fake. He's slamming, quote, leakers of what he called treasonous statements, saying the sources of those leaks will be hunted down and deserved long-term jail sentences. Tom Nichols and Tim O'Brien are back with us. Tom, the administration has pushed back on this WAPO reporting, but does the episode reveal more about the difficulty that they're facing in trying to wrap their arms around this war that they are clearly struggling to find an end to?
They're struggling because they're losing. And, it's interesting that the president's position is this is completely fake, but also a dangerously treasonous leak of something that, is obviously true. So the problem here is that they think that just executing operations over and over and over again will somehow produce the result they want, even though for 5 months that hasn't been the case. And so we're using up stocks of very expensive weapons that were never meant for this kind of a war, of knocking down cheap drones that we were saving for places like Europe and Asia. And I think the most important part of that story is Hegseth being very Trump-like and trying to throw his own deputy under the bus about why this is happening. The Deputy Secretary of Defense usually runs the Pentagon on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. Knowing this stuff is the Secretary of Defense's job. But because they don't have a strategy, they don't know what they're doing, they're obviously losing this war. The infighting has begun, and the bickering is now going to spill out into the public, as sometimes happens in cases like this.
Yeah, because it's not just the fact that there might be a munitions shortage, which frankly is not a secret, has been talked about on the Hill, has been true since the early part of sending aid to Ukraine. It's been an active conversation in military circles, but then also during testimonies on the Hill from relevant cabinet officials over the course of the last few years, including Hegseth in recent months. But it's the other issue of the fact that Hegseth may have misled the president, and that might be why he's casting blame on his deputy. But Tim, I'm wondering if this just shifts the spotlight onto Hegseth, because there have been moments where people on the Hill have been clear, Tom Tillis included, that say, I regret my vote to confirm him for various reasons. But he has also been one of the people who has continued driving home the same points about continued aggression in Iran and somehow that bringing different results, just like Trump. And I'm wondering if this administration starts looking for someone to eventually throw under the bus. Does it end up being Hegseth? Of
course, that's a possibility. And of course, it's exactly what Trump is thinking, because two things are problematic here. And whichever one they are, we don't know yet. But either Hegseth gave Trump the accurate information that U.S. munitions are perilously low, and Trump chose to ignore it, or Hegseth misled the president because he didn't want to deliver bad news. And this gets back to what Tom and I were kicking around in the prior block, that this is either a Soviet structure or a Tsarist structure. But the reality is people in Trump's inner circle are telling him what he wants to hear or are misleading him. And in this case, it has really, really dramatic real-world consequences. They have wasted a treasure trove of U.S. weaponry in Iran. Mm-hmm. They've left Ukraine, which now is so low on interceptors that they can't defend themselves against incoming Soviet or Russian attacks. They've moved the THAAD missile system from Korea into the Middle East, and that leaves our allies in East Asia exposed to Chinese aggressions. Yep. All of the knockoff effects of this misguided, ignorant policy that was done simply because Donald Trump took Bibi Netanyahu at his word and then pursued a war in which we've lost American lives, we spent American money, we've blown through American munitions, and we're stuck.
Yeah, right, because the exit ramp is the thing that they are struggling with the most. And the other person who initially was one of the voices saying, hey, we might not want to do this for a whole number of reasons, including the fact that one of the central tenets of being America first, as Trump campaigned on it, was not beginning new foreign entanglements or wars. And that's exactly where they are right now. I'm talking, of course, about Vice President Vance, who has been the face of talks with Iran, and the president, and who President Trump has said, joking, maybe not, that he'll blame Vance if there isn't a good deal. I want to play some of what Vance told Fox News just last night.
You have people who will attack what the president of the United States has said, but they don't want to use his name because they know that the president of the United States is too big a fish for them. So they'll come after me or they'll come after somebody else in the administration. That's my job, Laura. And if the worst thing that happens over the next couple of years is that I take some flack for the president in order to make his administration more successful, I think he'll be happy about that.
I mean, Tom, that is his job as vice president. That's true for other vice presidents as well. But there's a step further here, too, right? The way that Vance, who was against this privately, has now really been pushed into the spotlight to be the person defending it continuously.
Well, two things. One is, there isn't anybody in Trump's orbit who hasn't had to mortgage their soul for pennies on the dollar at this point, no matter what they may have believed or said or once claimed to believe. They've had to put it all on the altar of Donald Trump's ego. But the other part of this is, it's the vice president's job to take heat. A trade deal goes bad, inflation goes up. Normally, you don't want to see the president and the vice president that far apart during a war. You didn't want to see, George W. Bush turning to Dick Cheney and saying, well, if it goes wrong, I'm going to blame him. Mm-hmm. You didn't want to see, Ronald Reagan in Grenada saying, well, if this thing gets hairy, talk to George Bush. It's one thing for vice presidents to be a heat shield for unpopular policies. It's another thing to have this kind of division in the Oval Office during a war where American lives are at risk.
I think that's a great point. And then you layer on top of it the idea that for Vance, this is something he will have to carry with him for whatever his future aspirations are, including but not limited to potentially being president.
And he's trying to keep both of those doors open at the same time. He
Sure.
clearly wants to run. Mm-hmm. He clearly knows he can't alienate Trump because Trump will get him savage during the primaries, even if he can make it to the general election, which he probably can't without Trump's support in 2028. But precisely what Tom was saying, this is a ecosystem populated by zombies who've given up their independence and their own ethical compasses to basically serve Trump.
At a point where the Iran war, politically speaking, nothing to say of the economic and treasure cost, right? The number of human lives that have been lost. But politically, a very unpopular thing. The thing Republican strategists continue saying to me is the thing they are the most worried about as the midterm elections get closer. Tom Nichols, I want to thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Joining us now, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode, former assistant special agent in charge at the FBI, and MS Now national security and intelligence analyst Michael Feinberg, and senior fellow for Middle East and Africa studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Stephen Cook, and host of the Independent Americans podcast and founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America, Paul Reichoff. Paul always has to sit next to me. That's just how this goes. David, I'll start with you. Let's take the first part of President Trump's post. He's claiming that we have massive amounts of munitions and more are being manufactured. We've seen Reuters report that the U.S. has indeed signed a more than $3 billion deal with major weapons manufacturers to ramp up production of the Patriot and the THAAD interceptor parts. Where's the truth here, though? Where does our defensive weapons cache currently stand?
It's depleted. It's not empty, but it's depleted. And it takes time for these kind of missiles to be made, the Patriots in particular. But the Trump administration has had time to plan for what was going to play out when they chose to go to war with Iran. So this is no surprise. And I think it's good. I'm biased as a journalist, but in terms of the last part of the tweet, that this is somehow treasonous, 50,000 Americans are risking their lives right now for this country in the Persian Gulf. If they do not have the weapons they need to defend themselves, it's our job as journalists, if we have credible sources, to report that. And so it's astonishing to me that the president of the United States is saying whoever leaked this is guilty of treason and that they should be hunted down and get a long jail sentence. These service members deserve proper weapons.
To David's point, Paul, hunted down the sources of this? How can you hunt down, quote unquote, leakers or sources if you're not really denying the underpinning of what they've leaked?
Bingo. Yeah. I mean, if what they're saying is false, why is he trying to hunt them down? I think the bigger picture here is that the world is sick of Hegseth and his crap. And the country is sick of his crap, and the military is sick of his crap. And I think Trump's starting to get sick of his crap and his misstatements, his false truths, his lies, and his inability to report accurately what's happening on the ground and to include our stockpiles. So I think Pete Hegseth has always been on stable footing, supposedly, and they keep reiterating that, which means he may be soon seeing the underside of a bus pretty soon. This is not going well. And Trump is not good at taking responsibility for himself. Hegseth did not take responsibility himself. He blamed a subordinate, which is the failure of leadership again. But someone's going to have to be held accountable here, and Trump usually looks for a scapegoat.
Michael, if sources close to the president were privy to those discussions at Camp David and they're expressing these concerns about the depletion of our stockpile to the media, as David says, what does that signal to you?
It signals a few things to me, and I want to be clear. I was a national security investigator for most of my lifetime. I probably have a different opinion on how media leaks should be investigated than many of the members of this panel. Well, I mean, in general, I think there is a national security interest in protecting certain secret information from public if that information could be used by our adversaries against us. But in this case, my main takeaway is something totally different. And my main takeaway is that if an administration as riddled with ideological loyalists as this one is still leaking, that tells us that the situation is probably far more alarming than we actually realize. The difference between Trump 2 and Trump 1 is that there are no grown-ups this time who are taking their jobs out of a sense of obligation to be the adult in the room. Everybody knows what working for Trump is like at this point. And so the people who are going to work with him are not doing so out of a sense of patriotism or noblesse oblige or public service. They're doing it because they idolize the person who has become the personalist incarnation of the Republican Party. So if they're willing to leak what is going on behind closed doors, that really tells you something has gone off the rails.
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken. David, the Joint Chiefs Chair, Dan Kane, had warned about munition shortages even before this war began. According to the Washington Post, were those warnings essentially ignored? How serious were they back then, and compare it to now?
Yeah, the shortage of these munitions and how much they cost has been known for months, if not years. Right when the war started, we were reporting also on these warnings from Kane. So, again, this goes back to the president and also Secretary Hegseth. They, when you decide to go launch a major war like this, you have to consider worst case scenarios. And there's no question that what has happened is by far the worst case scenario and something the White House didn't anticipate. But it's their job to anticipate it. So they used huge amounts of weapons and different kinds of advanced bombs in the first days of the war. There were thousands of them dropped. And now they have a problem. But this is called planning. This is called competence. And they did not think through the worst case scenario. They appear to have been, just overconfident. And now, again, service members are now paying the price for poor planning.
And, Stephen, of course, there is this global dimension to this. Trump has said that it was our Middle East allies who urged him to call off the so-called major strike that he had been planning on Iran. And the reporting is that that's in large part because of the lack of defensive capabilities to thwart off any kind of retaliation from Iran. How vulnerable are our Middle East allies in the region, and how does that impact the course of the war?
They're quite vulnerable. We saw from the last round of actual conflict between the United States and Iran that the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris were hit and hit very hard. And that's because they don't have the interceptors, and the United States doesn't have the interceptors to protect them. The Saudis find themselves under fire from the Houthis again, and thanks only to NATO forces like Greek forces, who on a bilateral basis are in Saudi Arabia to help protect sensitive sites, has the damage in Saudi Arabia not been as devastating as it could be. The other real world consequence of this is, of course, it puts the United States in a relatively weaker negotiating position when it comes to the Iranians. The Iranians know, and America's partners know, that the United States cannot protect them. And so when it comes down to a negotiation, it's more likely for the United States and its partners on the other side of the Gulf to accept an agreement that most likely will favor Iran and its demands over having some control over the Strait of Hormuz.
So talk to me, Stephen, about how our adversaries are viewing all of this when you have the telegraphing of the depletion of munitions. To Michael's point, it may be contrary to national security interests that we now know all of this information. But how do forces like Russia and China view this?
Well, of course, since the very beginning of this conflict, and from the moment that the Iranians tried to close the Strait of Hormuz, the Chinese in particular have been paying close attention to how the United States would go about opening a waterway. So this is a very significant challenge, not just in the Middle East, but globally for the United States. These munitions, people talk about them as being built in a factory. It's more like workshops. It takes about a year to produce a Patriot missile. So this is going to be a long-term issue if we have expended as many as studies like the one coming out of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the leaks coming out of the Pentagon would suggest.
Paul, NBC News reports citing two senior officials that U.S. commanders are picking and choosing which Iranian missiles they should just let fall and which ones to intercept. How concerning should that be for our military servicemen and women and their families who are watching all of this unfold?
Deeply, especially considering how many have already gotten through and wounded and killed American forces. I think when it comes to Trump and Hegseth, you can't believe what they say. You have to watch what they do. And they're asking for $67 billion more. About $20 billion of that is for weapons and for munitions. We know we're using Tomahawks and ATACMS and Patriots, and we need them badly, and our allies need them badly. Meanwhile, Ukraine's getting pummeled, and the civilians there are dying by the day. Women and children are being killed, and they don't have enough munitions. So it's a great example of a misallocation of resources where Trump got way ahead of his skis. He didn't plan adequately. He didn't ask Congress for support, and he didn't ask Congress for enough money to fund what was turned out to be a very protracted war that's
now
making everyone
for $67 billion more. Just
and
put a fine point on that.
And $1.5 trillion at the end of the year.
Yeah. Michael, I do want to turn to the New York Times reporting that cites the FBI that there have been hacks of water systems at least almost a dozen different water systems across the country. There have been years of warning and neglect, according to the New York Times. Are we prepared to counter even a more serious attack than what we've seen on civilian infrastructure, whether it's water, our power grids?
I don't think so. I don't think we're remotely prepared. And I want to hasten to add that vulnerability is a choice. For years, if not decades, the private sector industries that make up much of our critical infrastructure have resisted security upgrades and any sort of oversight and regulation because it adds costs to their operations. Good security creates friction. It demands resources. It lessens usability sometime, but it's insurance. And we are now seeing the result of not having insurance. When you compound that with the fact that the Trump administration has decimated an organization called CISA, which traditionally did most of the government side of this type of security, this is entirely expectable. And unfortunately, Americans need to realize this is the future of warfare. We have networked everything in our lives, which means it is now vulnerable to cyber attack. And the oceans on either side of our continent are no longer protection against those with whom we would go to war.
The time frame we were existing under was unacceptable.
Okay, well,
and what this budget does, months and years, fast.
Years.
We're building new plants in real time.
So just to replace what we have expended.
I said months.
And then you said years.
It depends on the weapon system, but 2 to 3, 4x of what we have today.
Okay.
So yes, we're dealing with a reality under the previous administration of what they sent to Ukraine and what they allocated elsewhere.
Okay. Got it? Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. That was the mealy-mouthed, contradictory testimony of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in April. He did say in there, though, that it would take months and years or years, months and years, to replenish U.S. weapons stockpiles. A very troubling fact, considering our ongoing war with Iran and Donald Trump's penchant for escalating and stopping and escalating over and over again. A few months later, when asked about it, Hegseth grew combative and said a munitions shortage was a story manufactured by the media. As the war continues, there's a growing number of questions about our stockpiles. And at times, Pete Hegseth and others in the Trump administration have blamed former President Joe Biden for sending weapons to Ukraine. In fact, Donald Trump sent weapons to Ukraine in the last hour with the cameras rolling. But behind the scenes, it is a different story. According to brand new reporting in the Washington Post, Donald Trump confronted Pete Hegseth about the country's supply of munitions very recently. From that report, quote, Trump's frustration over the Iran war boiled over at Camp David last week, where he demanded answers from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on why he had apparently been misled on extreme munitions shortages that now threaten to limit military options with Iran. That is according to two people familiar with that exchange. Quote, the encounter took place on the sidelines of his cabinet meeting at Camp David on Friday, where Trump vented at Hegseth that he thought the munitions issue, quote, had been fixed, according to both people familiar with the conversation, who spoke anonymously due to fear of retaliation. The White House immediately denied the reporting, and last night in a post on social media that was posted at 12:34 a.m., Donald Trump denied it as well. The only problem in denying it, he also attempted to refute the reporting and kind of sort of ended up confirming it. The post reads in part, quote, the U.S. has massive amounts of munitions, especially of certain types. Additionally, large amounts are being manufactured and shipped to the U.S. as needed. The leakers of these treasonous statements are being hunted down. Long-term jail sentences will be sought. The funny thing is, if any of this is funny, if you're going to prosecute someone for a leak, that generally means the information that is in the paper is so true that it's dangerous, because lies are not punishable with jail time. Donald Trump revealing the accuracy of reporting while trying to deny it and jail the people at the same time is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Military analyst, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling is here. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. Also joining us, managing editor at The Bulwark, contributor Sam Stein is here, and writer and editor for Protect Democracy, Amanda Carpenter is here. General Hertling, your thoughts on the, I guess now confirmed by Donald Trump, reporting that he blew up at Pete Hegseth in this Camp David cabinet meeting?
Nicole, the entire Washington Post story was fascinating because it confirms what a lot of people have been thinking for the last several months. I mean, Pete Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth, has stood before not only Congress, but the American people on multiple occasions and talked about how the U.S. military has conducted 14,000 strikes against Iran. Now, those strikes come from somewhere. And we also have heard Mr. Netanyahu talking about that Israel has intercepted over 1,400 either drones or missiles coming toward Israel, which means there are a lot more drones and missiles going to places like Jordan and UAE and Qatar. And when you have drones and missiles going into different countries, you intercept them with very expensive weapon systems like the Patriot and the THAAD interceptors. Those are two very expensive missiles. The Patriot cost about $5 million per missile. The THAAD cost about $12 million per missile. Additionally, if you're conducting 14,000 strikes, as Mr. Hegseth has said, you're usually using Army ATACMS missiles with 300-mile range, and also the PRISM missiles, which the Army has, over 300 miles range, along with the aircraft. Those are very expensive missiles as well. Both of them over $2 million apiece. So when you're talking about, the kinds of things they're now refuting, it's not just a depletion of ammunition, it's also a depletion of credibility, because you can't conduct all these strikes, which they're bragging about, and at the same time say that a very limited supply of missiles are still available. Plus, the last thing that we'll talk about is Secretary Hegseth, during that congressional hearing, said that we were building factories by the month or years, like you just stated. But the problem is with that, it takes a long time to build factories, and it takes an even longer time to build these very precise weapon systems that come out of the factories. So you can't just fix it, as the president said when he allegedly asked Mr. Hegseth about this. It's not something that can be recovered. This is a long-term problem, and the military has been facing it. And we've also heard, I'll just add one more thing, a combatant commander in the Pacific region saying he was concerned about being able to execute his contingency plans because they were moving things like THAAD launchers from Korea, but also the missiles to the Middle East from his area of operation. So I'm just using battlefield math and battlefield common sense in terms of some of these weapon systems, and the stories don't add up.
Well, I want to, that is my job to bolster the Washington Post reporting, but it's not the first time we heard about the limited supply of munitions. I want to just share some reporting from February, also in the Washington Post. Trump's top general foresees acute risks in an attack on Iran. Quote, General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, expressed his concerns at a White House meeting last week with Trump and his top aides, these people said, cautioning that any major operation against Iran will face challenges because the U.S. munitions stockpile has been significantly depleted by Washington's ongoing defense of Israel and support for Ukraine. Kane's remarks at the White House meeting have not been previously reported. That's from February. So this starts, General Hertling, with the top general's concern about limited supply, and then runs a course of Trump's erratic announced escalations, seemingly not attached to a military or diplomatic strategy for winning the war in Iran. What do you think has happened since February when there was already concern? And just explain a little bit more why the widening of the war and Iran's penchant for striking our allies in the region means that we have to spread more of these interceptors and munitions to our allies to protect them as well.
Yeah, we've put air defense systems in countries like Jordan, Oman, Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. So each one of them has a system, either the THAAD or the Patriot, which the military classifies as high demand, low density, which means everybody wants one, but there's not enough to go around. You know, the 4 soldiers that were killed in Jordan last month were all a couple of weeks ago, were all air defenders. 2 of them, the 2 males, were from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The 2 females were from Ansbach, Germany. That tells me that they're moving air defense systems away from other locations where they normally are to protect these allied nations. And when you protect them, you're shooting rockets against drones and cruise missiles that are coming in. The last thing I'll say, Nicole, that's important, you just brought up back in February, this was mentioned. That's the first time a lot of people understood it, but I've been watching it for a lot longer than that and been concerned about it. I had an honor to be a member of the Joint Staff as a principal for 2 years. On the Joint Staff, there's also someone who counts missiles and how many they're going at, a 3-star general, the J4, a J8 who talks about acquisitions, the J3 that looks at operations, and the J5 that looks at strategic resourcing. All 3-star generals, all reporting directly to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who tells the Secretary of Defense and the President what's going on. If that wasn't happening back then, it's either the fault of General Kane or the fact that Secretary Hegseth did not understand what was happening and didn't tell the president, or the fact that the president wasn't listening. So there may be multiple failures in the whole supply chain. And I'll just say one more thing, that logistics determines the art of the possible in warfare. When you don't have the logistics, when you don't have the ammunition, you can't do the things that you want to do.
When it comes to the war with Iran, we've gotten plenty of rosy proclamations, finger-pointing, and flat-out lies from the Trump administration. But, folks, these past few days have really been something else. On Tuesday, Reuters published this headline: U.S. has used virtually all of its long-range precision missiles during Iran war. Now, publicly, the Trump administration has tried to downplay it, but privately, they're saying something else. The Washington Post reports that last Friday, Trump demanded answers from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth about why he had apparently been misled about extreme munitions shortages. And Hegseth, the testosterone-touting man that he is, defended himself by doing what we've seen him do before: blame someone else. Hegseth reportedly blamed his deputy for the shortages and for not making sure Trump was fully informed. Now, today, Trump insists that there's no problem at all, no munitions issue at all, no beef with Hegseth at all. But despite all of that, nothing to see here, all of that, there's nothing going on. Today, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Trump has ordered new investigations into the disclosures of the Pentagon's munitions stockpile. Joining me now is New York Democratic Congressman Pat Ryan. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee and an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Iraq. It's good to see you, sir. So Trump apparently believes he's been misled on the munitions shortages. Do you buy that?
He is so out of touch, out of reality. I think they feed him a slow diet of missile strike video clips, and then he goes back to whatever other distraction. And it would be humorous if not for the fact that we've got 50,000 troops in the region.
That part.
And we've lost 18 soldiers. Every American is paying the price. Gas is back up over $4. And it is infuriating, especially to those of us that have served in the last generation's forever wars, to see us now 6 months into what was supposed to be a 6-week war, and they won't even be honest about the state of our munitions. And by the way, they're still covering up casualties. They're not even attributing these last 4 brave Americans lost in combat to this war. It is just beyond the pale.
From your perch on the Armed Services Committee, can this stockpile be replenished? Look, if the reporting's out there, there must be something very serious happening with them. I don't know what you're hearing. Maybe you can share specifically some of the details of that. But is it really that bad?
From everything we know, and this has been the case for several months, we knew the burn rate of these munitions was incredibly dangerous. Literally in early March, a week into the war, I questioned a senior Pentagon leader about this exact problem, and they just denied the reality that we were hearing from folks on the ground. The problem is we have expended so many munitions in just a few months that it will literally take us a decade plus just to get back to the level of interceptors and precision strike missiles, which are incredibly expensive, incredibly slow to produce. That means other adversaries around the world now, particularly China, to a certain degree Russia, know that we're weak and vulnerable. That makes every American less safe. And look, if you can't even recognize and own and be honest about the problem, how are we expected to fix it? And again, we can't say it enough. This is a grave disservice to our troops in uniform who are now in more danger because of Hegseth's complete clown car of a Pentagon that he's running.
Well, given what you've just said, Congressman, you've been out there making very clear that there needs to be a full audit of the Pentagon. And so now you've got this administration that's scrambling to replenish munition stockpiles. They're also looking to spend money on things like building 25 nuclear-powered battleships, which Trump has called part of his Golden Fleet or Golden Dome missile defense program. What does that say about the priorities of this administration, and what should be the priorities of the United States Congress when it comes to the defense of the nation?
I think what we're seeing in the president's priorities are enriching himself, enriching his buddies that are the CEOs of these defense companies. I mean, his own sons have bought huge shares in a bunch of companies that are now making huge profits on this war. While, of course, we know Trump himself never served. Certainly no Trump family members that I know that are signing up to go on this war. It's our young people, working class people that are going to war. So he is 180 degrees off, particularly for somebody who ran on stopping wars. What we need to do is One, $1 trillion plus defense budget is outrageous when we need to be investing in housing and healthcare, bringing down gas and grocery and utility costs. So we got to get our priorities back straight there. We also need to stop giving tax breaks to billionaires. We give $1 trillion tax break to the ultra wealthy to further add to our deficit in addition to the $1 trillion defense budget. When it comes to the Armed Services Committee, myself and my colleagues in a hopeful majority, which I'm optimistic about, need to immediately have urgent oversight. One, to protect our troops. Two, to get back at the apolitical nature of our military, which Trump has eroded. And three, most importantly, we have to end this war, cut off the funding stream. I have a bill called the No Funds for Iran War Act that would not allow us to spend a single dollar more on this war.
All right. There is Congressman Pat Ryan. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate you. Folks, we'll be right back.
Thanks for having me.
New tonight, MS Now has confirmed that Oman and Iran have come to an agreement, at least on the framework of a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That's according to two Middle East diplomats with knowledge of the negotiations. Now, folks, I say framework of a deal because those sources did not tell us specific details of the temporary deal. They also did not share what issues have yet to be resolved. An Iranian government official linked to the deal told MS Now, quote, "It will establish new shipping routes by allowing commercial vessels to enter the Persian Gulf through an Iranian-controlled route and exit through a route controlled by Oman." The agreement, according to the Iranian official, does not include the collection of tolls from commercial shipping vessels seeking safe passage through the waterway, which Iran has previously sought. The proposal is a, quote, temporary agreement that would lay the foundation for Washington and Tehran to call a new ceasefire and resume the nuclear negotiations that began in mid-June, but collapsed after retaliatory strikes by both sides across the region. This comes after Donald Trump spent the day lashing out at the Washington Post for their reporting. Listen to this. They detailed a confrontation between Donald Trump and his Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth at Camp David just last week. The blow-up was reportedly over the dwindling state of U.S. weapons stockpiles and its impact on Trump's war in Iran. The White House press secretary has denied the Washington Post's reporting. No shocker there. In an overnight social media post, Trump wrote, quote, "The U.S. has massive amounts of munitions." Munitions is in quotes for some reason. They're not sure why. And that the leakers of these treasonous statements are being hunted down. Long-term jail sentences will be sought. Exclamation point, of course. Then this afternoon, another rambling social media post, Donald Trump accused the Washington Post and others of, quote, spreading false and completely unfounded rumors and called the Washington Post treasonous. So which one is it? Were there leakers or was the reporting false? It's worth considering that Donald Trump's fury over this may just be the tale. His fury may also be coming from the fact that on day 160 of his war in Iran, it is still unclear exactly where this is all going and will end. And it seems that Iran knows that. The current political calendar here in our country is in their favor. According to the Wall Street Journal, Iran's leadership has made a high-stakes calculation in its showdown with President Trump. Maintaining control over the Strait of Hormuz is a non-negotiable red line. With gasoline prices and inflation elevated, Tehran believes Trump will ultimately accept its terms ahead of fast-approaching midterm elections that could determine the future of his presidency. The short version, that political pressure is real. Let's listen to what those Trump voters in Ohio told MS Now's Alex Tabbitt earlier this week.
Do you see this war benefiting the United States of America or your life in any way?
No. No, I don't.
Do you see any way in which this war is benefiting your life?
Nope. I don't. I really don't. No. I don't know what they're fighting over in the first place, you know?
Our next guest, Tom Nichols, recently wrote in The Atlantic about Donald Trump's complete inability to navigate the seemingly unnecessary war that he started. Quote, "Many Americans and much of the rest of the world have become inured to Donald Trump's strange rants when he shouts about sharks, when he drones on about his brilliant uncle, when he casually ponders, violating the Constitution. His supporters try to dress his statements up as some kind of strategy. The war in Iran, however, has shown that Trump's inability to perceive reality has become truly dangerous. He led the United States into a disastrous conflict because he thought his gut was smarter than the advisors who warned him that deposing Iran's regime was unlikely. He continues to mislead the American people and perhaps himself about America's strategic defeat at the hands of one of its worst enemies. The world economy and the balance of power have been changed, perhaps for many decades to come. Because Trump cannot draw links between cause and effect, he does not understand that his actions and the failures that follow are somehow related to each other. Joining us now, the man that wrote those words, Tom Nichols, Professor Emeritus at the U.S. Naval War College and staff writer at The Atlantic. First off, sir, what is your reaction to the news tonight that Iran and Oman have reached an agreement to temporarily open the Strait of Hormuz?
It's just remarkable that after 5 months of war, Iran is going to control the Strait of Hormuz, which it didn't before Trump launched this war. It leaves us, the United States, the West, and the rest of the world worse off. And for what? That's the question that we keep asking and have to keep asking about this war. What was all this for? Donald Trump thought he was going to get a quick, cheap, easy win, knock over the Iranian regime. And now here we are with Iran basically saying, well, we'll control the strait, but we'll agree to think about whether we're going to collect tolls, which, if you had told anybody that a year ago, it would have seemed almost preposterous, almost impossible.
Yeah, many Republicans I talked to say the president went to Venezuela, and then he thought he could do that everywhere. I also want to move to your reaction to this Washington Post reporting. It gives us a little bit of a glimpse into Pete Hegseth's leadership and the communication, I guess, between him and his boss, Donald Trump. In this case, on the depletion of American missiles, a really important piece of reporting there.
Yeah, that it's a mistake to use the words Pete Hegseth and leadership together, especially when your first reaction is to throw your own deputy under the bus and to basically say, well, in a way, what was Hegseth saying? How could I be expected to know this stuff? I'm only the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, as he puts it. Mm-hmm. It's also, as you pointed out in your earlier reporting, Eugene, that, which is it? Is the president going to pursue people for revealing, dire information, or is the whole thing false? And I think that the anger that you're seeing from the White House and the Pentagon about this says that the reporting is accurate. And I would just tell people, you don't need access to classified, deep secrets to figure this out. There are people all over the world who keep track of how many missiles the United States buys, how many it stockpiles, and how many it fires. You can do a lot of this reckoning and calculation from open sources. And I think what you're seeing is that the Post and other outlets are confirming what other people around the world are seeing. And it just shows what a reckless and stupid war this was to just blunder in without a plan or a strategy.
Something that President Trump was reportedly warned about, too, from his leads there. In your piece for The Atlantic, you wrote about how Donald Trump continues to mislead the American people when it comes to Iran. But is his staff misleading him? Why does he seem confused about these things? Or are they equally delusional about this war in Iran?
I think you have two things going on. One is that his staff is terrified of him. And so when he gets wrapped up in this kind of delusional stuff about, oh, we're winning, right? And they show him all this B-roll footage of stuff blowing up. It's everybody around him says, yes, sir, absolutely. You bet, winning. But I also think he knows, and that a lot of what he's saying is just lying. I mean, how many times? I think we're up to something like 40 separate times the president has said, we're on the verge of a deal. Deal's imminent. They want a deal. They're going to make a deal tomorrow. He knows that's not true. He knows it. The people around him know it. Every time the president says we're winning, there are so many lies and misstatements and misleading things the president has said. He has to know. But there's also the problem that Trump does try to kind of manifest reality and wish things into being just by saying them out loud. So I think it's a combination of both, to be honest.
Yeah, it's like wishful thinking and war don't have anything to do with each other. Tom Nichols, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.